When you stop reacting, you don't just walk away. You push the self-destruct button on a dynamic they spent years building to trap you. And the exact reason they lose their minds when you detach has nothing to do with love and everything to do with the terrifying collapse of their own mirrored reflection. We often talk about emotional intelligence as the ability to navigate feelings with grace, empathy, and social agility. But there is a darker side to emotional bandwidth, one found in the rare archetype of the super empath. You possess a profound, almost biological radar for emotional subtext. You felt their wounds before they spoke them. You absorbed their chaos and metabolized it, believing your patience was a bridge. But what happens when that infinite well runs dry? What happens when the bridge burns down, not with anger, but with absolute terrifying silence? The core paradox of narcissistic dynamics centers on the reliance upon emotional reactivity as a renewable energy source, meaning that when a super empath completely detaches, that vital supply line instantly severs and triggers a severe psychological crisis. In toxic interpersonal frameworks, individuals with high narcissistic traits struggle to generate a stable, authentic sense of self-worth from within. Instead, they unconsciously depend on the emotional outputs of those around them to regulate their fragile self-image. Every display of frustration, every tearful defense, and every frantic attempt by a partner to restore peace functions as an energetic transaction. The narcissist extracts this emotional currency, converts it into external validation, and leaves the other person profoundly depleted. This parasitic cycle relies entirely on the target remaining emotionally engaged, responsive, and willing to participate in the cyclic chaos of highs and lows. When a super empath, someone equipped with deep emotional intelligence, acute awareness of subtext, and an immense capacity for compassion, finally reaches their breaking point, the dynamic changes instantly. True detachment is not merely physical distance or temporary silence. It is a profound internal withdrawal of emotional investment. When this occurs, the narcissist is suddenly cut off from their primary source of emotional regulation. The feedback loop that validates their grandiosity abruptly shatters, leaving them exposed to the very internal emptiness and insecurity they spent a lifetime avoiding. Because they lack genuine self-soothing mechanisms, the sudden absence of the empath's emotional reflection induces panic. They no longer have an external mirror to validate their narrative of superiority or victimization. This abrupt severance creates an unbearable psychological vacuum. Without the friction of arguments or the comfort of the empath's endless forgiveness, the narcissist faces the chilling reality of their own irrelevance within the dynamic. The detachment strips away the power they held over the individual, rendering all their usual manipulation tactics, such as guilt-tripping, gaslighting, and intermittent reinforcement, entirely obsolete. Because anger and sadness act as proof of ongoing connection, absolute emotional neutrality or a total lack of response denies them the fuel they desperately crave. Consequently, the inability to handle this detachment stems from the fact that it exposes the structural fragility of their entire relational model. When the empath stops playing their assigned role, the illusion collapses entirely, forcing the narcissist to confront a reality where their emotional control no longer exists, leaving them defenseless against their own unaddressed internal void. Emotional intelligence and manipulation represent two fundamentally contrasting approaches to human interaction, where genuine emotional awareness is rooted in self-regulation, authentic connection, and the accurate reading of emotional fields, while narcissism utilizes surface-level charm and manufactured empathy that inevitably collapse under the weight of genuine, unreactive composure. True emotional intelligence, often studied through the lens of psychological awareness and social agility, involves the capacity to recognize, understand, and manage one's own emotions while navigating the emotional states of others with empathy and integrity. It requires a high degree of internal stability, allowing an individual to remain grounded during conflict, set firm boundaries, and foster mutual understanding without resorting to control or coercion. This form of intelligence builds bridges based on vulnerability, accountability, and the shared reality of human experience. In stark contrast, the narcissistic utilization of social and emotional cues operates as a calculated mechanism for control rather than connection. Individuals exhibiting high narcissistic traits often possess a sharp, predatory form of social awareness. They can read a room, mirror a target's deepest desires, and project an image of profound understanding or charm. However, this charm is not driven by empathy. It is a tactical facade designed to disarm boundaries and establish dominance. They study a person's emotional blueprint not to connect, but to locate vulnerabilities, insecurities, and areas where compliance can be extracted. This surface-level mimicry of emotional intelligence allows them to construct an idealized version of themselves that feels irresistible to those who naturally seek depth and harmony in relationships. The critical vulnerability of this manipulative framework is its complete reliance on the external cooperation and emotional reactivity of the target. Because the narcissist's charm is merely a superficial performance lacking genuine internal depth or self-regulation, it cannot sustain itself when confronted with authentic, unreactive composure. When a super empath detaches and adopts absolute emotional neutrality, the narcissist's sophisticated tactics are stripped of their power. The superficial charm falls flat because there is no longer an emotional ecosystem to manipulate, and the weaponized insights bounce off a quiet, resolute boundary. Without the feedback loop of reactivity, the narcissist's performance collapses under its own artificial weight, revealing the fragile, dysregulated core hidden beneath the polished exterior and exposing the fundamental emptiness of their manipulative approach. The mirror effect in toxic relationship dynamics acts as a profound psychological mechanism where a super-empathic partner's sudden detachment forces the narcissist to confront the exact internal void they have spent a lifetime avoiding. Within the architecture of narcissistic behavior, the target functions not as an autonomous individual with separate emotional needs, but as a living, breathing mirror designed to reflect back an inflated, idealized self-image of grandiosity, infallibility, and unearned dominance. Throughout the duration of the relationship, the empath absorbs the narcissist's projected chaos, validates their fragile ego, and continuously mirrors back a version of them that feels powerful, secure, and admired. This constant reflection protects the narcissist from experiencing the deep-seated shame, inadequacy, and emptiness that lurk just beneath their confident exterior. When the super empath finally detaches, they abruptly shatter this mirror by refusing to provide any further reflections. This sudden absence of emotional mirroring creates an immediate psychological crisis for the narcissist. Without the constant stream of external validation and mirrored importance, the protective illusion dissolves instantly. The narcissist is left staring directly into the terrifying reality of their own unintegrated self, confronting an internal landscape devoid of genuine emotional depth, stability, or authentic self-worth. Because their entire psychological identity is built upon external props and the reactions of others, the removal of the empath's mirror feels like a literal erasure of their self-concept, triggering intense panic and disorientation. This dynamic explains why the narcissist reacts with such profound hostility or frantic attempts to re-engage the target. The detachment forces them into an enforced self-reflection that they lack the emotional maturity to process. Instead of seeing a functional, independent human being walking away, the narcissist experiences the silence and neutrality as a stark, uncompromising reflection of their own internal failure and emotional bankruptcy. The mirror effect turns the empath's absence into an inescapable spotlight, illuminating the very vulnerabilities the narcissist has spent years hiding behind layers of manipulation, grandiosity, and control, ultimately exposing the fragile, hollow foundation upon which their entire interpersonal reality rests. The extinction burst represents a predictable psychological phenomenon wherein a behavior that has previously been reinforced suddenly stops producing the expected response, causing a temporary escalation in the intensity, frequency, and variety of that behavior before it ultimately extinguishes. In the context of narcissistic dynamics, When a super empath completely detaches and refuses to engage, supply, or react, the narcissist experiences an abrupt denial of their accustomed emotional reward. Having relied on manipulation, guilt, or charm to successfully re-engage targets in the past, they immediately assume that their usual tactics simply need to be applied with greater force or volume. This triggers an extinction burst characterized by a frantic escalation of behaviors designed to breach the newly established boundaries and restore the lost dynamic of control. Initially, this escalation may manifest as intense charm-offensive strategies, often referred to as hoovering, where the narcissist attempts to rewrite history, shower the target with affection, or mimic deep remorse to lure them back into the fold. When warmth and sweet-talking fail to produce the desired reaction, the behavioral escalation quickly pivots toward more aggressive or destabilizing tactics. This can include playing the victim to induce guilt, launching smear campaigns among mutual acquaintances to damage the empath's reputation, flooding communication channels with erratic messages, or deploying aggressive gaslighting. Every maneuver in this volatile arsenal is engineered to provoke any form of emotional response, because to a narcissist, anger, frustration, or even defensive arguing serves as undeniable proof that they still hold psychological leverage and emotional power over the target. As the super empath maintains absolute emotional neutrality and steadfast boundaries, these escalating maneuvers hit a permanent wall, leading to the ultimate collapse of the cycle. The extinction burst fails because the required fuel, emotional reactivity, is completely withheld from the system. Without the renewable energy source of the target's distress, the narcissist's tactics burn through their remaining momentum and ultimately lose all operational efficacy. This period of heightened volatility represents the final, desperate thrashing of a failing dynamic. Once the extinction burst runs its course without yielding any results, the narcissist is forced to confront the absolute permanence of the detachment, leaving the relationship permanently severed and allowing the empath to experience true, uncompromised freedom from the cycle of manipulation. If you've ever experienced that sudden, chilling shift where your empathy finally turned into apathy, hit that subscribe button right now. We are decoding the psychological mechanics of toxic dynamics every single week. The power of apathy in a toxic dynamic stems from the fundamental truth that absolute emotional neutrality strips a narcissist of their control, whereas expressions of anger, pleading, or sadness serve as valid currency that feeds their need for dominance. When a relationship begins to fracture, the typical human response involves emotional appeals, expressions of hurt or righteous anger intended to make the other person understand the pain they have caused. However, in interactions with someone high in narcissistic traits, these very reactions act as a confirmation of their power. Whether the response is tearful distress or explosive fury, it signals to the narcissist that they still occupy a central place in your emotional world. It proves that they can manipulate your internal state simply by pushing the right buttons, thereby reinforcing their belief that they hold the upper hand in the psychological hierarchy. In direct contrast, absolute emotional neutrality, often described as apathy or the gray rock method, fundamentally destabilizes this equation. When a super empath detaches and responds to provocation with total calm, lack of interest, or complete silence, the narcissist is starved of the emotional feedback they require to sustain their maneuvers. Anger and defensiveness require an energetic exchange, but true apathy is a dead end. It communicates that the narcissist's behavior no longer matters, that their insults have lost their sting, and that their attempts at provocation are entirely weightless. This sudden withdrawal of reactivity denies them the satisfaction of seeing their target struggle, leaving them with no leverage points to exploit, and no emotional fuel to convert into validation. By stepping out of the emotional arena entirely, the empath transforms the dynamic from a contest of wills into an insurmountable wall of indifference. The narcissist relies on friction to generate momentum, but apathy offers nothing to push against. Consequently, the power of apathy lies in its ability to render every manipulation tactic completely obsolete. Without the feedback loop of emotional reactivity, the narcissist's control evaporates, leaving them isolated within their own manufactured chaos, while the empath reclaims complete sovereignty over their peace of mind and emotional energy. Somatic calibration describes the profound reality that a super empath's detachment is not merely a cognitive choice or a calculated intellectual decision, but rather a whole-body nervous system regulation that fundamentally refuses to synchronize with the chaotic, dysregulated frequency of the narcissist. While the conscious mind may recognize toxic patterns and decide to walk away, true healing requires the physical body to stop keeping score and break its deep physiological addiction to the relationship. Over the course of a high-conflict dynamic, an empath's autonomic nervous system often becomes trapped in a continuous loop of hypervigilance, mirroring the chronic instability, anxiety, and unpredictable adrenaline spikes of the narcissistic partner. The body learns to live in a constant state of fight or flight, finely tuned to read every subtle shift in tone, micro-expression, and environmental tension as a potential threat. When the empath finally initiates true detachment, somatic calibration takes place as the nervous system actively resets its baseline away from this chronic state of chaos. Instead of continuing to absorb the erratic, energetic frequency of the narcissist, the body undergoes a biological recalibration towards safety, stillness, and internal regulation. This somatic shift makes it physically impossible to re-engage with the toxic dynamic, even if the conscious mind attempts to rationalize returning. The physical body rejects the old patterns, manifesting visceral discomfort, exhaustion, or profound aversion at the mere thought of stepping back into the toxic environment. The nervous system recognizes that syncing up with the narcissist requires a self-destructive sacrifice of its own biological peace. This bodily refusal to match the narcissist's dysregulated frequency creates an insurmountable barrier to manipulation. Even if the narcissist deploys charm, guilt, or theatrical displays of distress, the empath's calibrated nervous system remains grounded, steady, and unresponsive to the manufactured urgency. Somatic calibration shifts the locus of control from an intellectual debate into an embodied reality, where peace is no longer just an idea, but a visceral biological state of being. By aligning the physical body with authentic boundaries, the super empath breaks the invisible somatic tethers that once bound them to the chaos, anchoring themselves in a permanent state of nervous system sovereignty that no external manipulation can ever disrupt or dysregulate again. The deep cognitive dissonance experienced by a narcissist during a super empath's detachment stems from a direct, violent collision between their internal narrative of absolute superiority and the objective reality of being abandoned. Narcissists operate behind an intricate psychological fortress constructed to maintain an unshakable belief in their own flawlessness, infallibility, and grandiosity. Within this distorted framework, they view themselves as the ultimate prize, the master manipulator, and the indispensable center of everyone else's universe. They rely on the continuous compliance, adoration, or emotional distress of their targets to reinforce this grand illusion. When a partner walks away with effortless composure, it shatters the core foundational belief that the narcissist is irreplaceable, unleashing an overwhelming wave of cognitive dissonance that their fragile ego cannot naturally process. Cognitive dissonance occurs when an individual holds two contradictory beliefs simultaneously, in this case, the absolute conviction of their own supreme dominance versus the undeniable, glaring evidence that someone has willingly chosen to leave them behind into absolute insignificance. Because the narcissist's psychological architecture lacks the capacity for genuine self-reflection, accountability, or vulnerability, they cannot reconcile this painful contradiction by admitting their own toxic behavior or relational failures. Doing so would risk collapsing their entire sense of self, exposing the deep-seated shame, inadequacy, and emptiness they have spent a lifetime avoiding. Instead, the cognitive dissonance creates an intense, unbearable psychological pressure that manifests as confusion, frantic attempts at cognitive distortion, and sudden bouts of rage directed outward at the target. To escape this agonizing mental friction, the narcissist often scrambles to rewrite history, convincing themselves and anyone who will listen that they were actually the victim or that the empath was somehow defective all along. Yet, despite these defensive mental gymnastics, the underlying reality of the rejection lingers, gnawing at the edges of their inflated self-image. The empath's departure acts as an unerasable proof that the narcissist's grandiosity is nothing more than a fragile facade. By refusing to validate the narcissist's internal script, the detaching partner leaves them stranded in an unresolvable psychological paradox where their self-proclaimed superiority is permanently invalidated by the quiet, unyielding power of someone who simply chose peace over participation. Reclaiming the internal locus of control represents the ultimate milestone in emotional mastery, where an individual anchors their self-worth entirely within their own internal framework, rendering themselves completely immune to external validation loops and narcissistic extraction. In codependent or toxic relational dynamics, the locus of control is dangerously externalized. An individual's sense of peace, happiness, and value depends almost entirely on how the narcissist treats them, whether they approve or how well the relationship is functioning at any given moment. This outward anchoring makes a person uniquely vulnerable to manipulation, as the narcissist effectively holds the keys to their emotional well-being, using intermittent reinforcement, guilt, and praise to dictate their emotional reality. Reclaiming this locus means dismantling that external dependency and shifting the foundation of identity back to where it rightfully belongs. True emotional mastery begins with the radical realization that nobody else gets to define your worth, dictate your emotional state, or lease space in your mind without your explicit consent. When you anchor your self-worth internally, external chaos loses its gravitational pull. The narcissist's approval, disapproval, smear campaigns, or dramatic outbursts cease to function as psychological levers because you no longer require their validation to feel secure. Instead of seeking safety outside yourself through pleasing, fixing, or arguing, you cultivate a deep, unshakable self-trust. You recognize that your value is inherent, permanent, and entirely disconnected from the manipulative appraisals of someone incapable of authentic connection. This internal anchoring transforms your relationship with empathy itself. Rather than letting your natural compassion be weaponized as an unlimited resource for someone else's emotional regulation, you learn to direct that immense capacity inward first. You practice self-compassion, emotional self-regulation, and rigorous boundary enforcement, treating your peace as a non-negotiable priority. By cutting off the external supply lines of validation, you starve the narcissistic dynamic of its fuel while simultaneously fortifying your own spirit. Reclaiming the internal locus of control turns your sovereignty into an unbreakable shield, ensuring that you can walk away from toxic environments not with bitterness or lingering attachment, but with the quiet, powerful certainty that your emotional freedom belongs entirely to you. The journey from toxic entanglement to absolute liberation reveals a profound psychological truth. A narcissist's entire world is built on borrowed energy and fragile illusions. When a super empath chooses to detach, they do not simply end a relationship. They dismantle the very foundation of the narcissist's control. By replacing reaction with radical neutrality, the empath starves the dynamic of its fuel, exposing the internal void the narcissist has spent a lifetime running from. The frantic extinction bursts, the crumbling mirror effect, and the unresolvable cognitive dissonance are all proof that genuine, unshakable composure is an insurmountable wall to manipulation. Ultimately, this detachment is not an act of malice, but an act of supreme reclamation. By anchoring your locus of control within your own sovereign peace, you transform your empathy from an exploited resource into an unbreachable shield, stepping out of the chaos and into a life where your emotional freedom belongs entirely to you.